Hello and welcome to our panel, Suspense, in narrative games, a subtle storytelling technique. So my name is Grace.
And I'm Justin.
Yeah, we both are executive directors for the Virtual Video Game Orchestra, and we have been doing panels for the past few years at MAGFest, so we are excited to be here again and talk about narrative games. Oh no, Discord?
Discord. We want to keep everyone on their toes.
Yeah, okay. Let's get going. All right, so this whole talk is about narrative games, so we should first talk about what they are. How do we define them? So, in general, narrative games are a very unique storytelling medium. They, are a mix of writing, visuals, audio, and most importantly, interaction. Interaction between the player and the character you're playing as. So this interaction is key because it increases the immersion you feel playing the game and the empathy you feel for the character that you're playing as. So there's oftentimes these are compared to cinema, but the biggest difference is this interaction aspect. You don't get to interact really with characters in a movie, but in a game, a narrative game specifically, you do. So this will affect the timing of scenes, music, and it also creates the illusion that the player is in some kind of control. You don't always have, full reign, but a lot of the times you have choices to choose that can affect small aspects of the plot, so it makes you feel like you have some aspect of control over what happens in this story.
So the main goals in narrative games, which are pretty straightforward, is you want to tell a compelling story that's also has an element of interactivity, which is what, as Grace said, separates it from the other mediums. We keep double pressing. And as some of the pillars of doing that, what we're doing is we want to be able to tell a natural story, which again has to do with making the interaction feel genuine with actually participating, rather than just kind of being on rails the entire time, that there's some element that makes you feel like you're experiencing it firsthand. And as part of that, empowering the player to participate, whether that's something as simple as just having free roam to walk around and look at the environment, look at the subtle details in the storytelling, or full-on decisions that are going to affect the outcome of the story. And of course, using a variety of artistic techniques. That's not just the video, not just the music, not just the actual writing, but you have this conglomeration of everything together that just poses you with a lot of unique combinations that you can do that's hard to replicate in other mediums.
All right, so the title of our talk is about suspense. So let's first talk about what we mean by suspense. According to the dictionary, suspense is a state or feeling of excited or anxious uncertainty about what may happen. And that is totally true in the aspect of games, but we have a slightly different definition for suspense in the context of narrative games. For our purposes, suspense is elongated narrative techniques to sustain a connection with the player, and this allows the story to progress with the player rather than for the player. So this focuses on emotion, the emotional connection the player has with the story, and it also embraces the dead space between important scenes. Because this is told at your own pace, there's going to be times where the player is not, just actively following the plot. You're exploring around, you're looking, you're doing side quests, you're thinking about what is happening. So narrative games really use that to their advantage to create suspense, and we're going to talk about that. Yep.
Yep. And then also understanding the player's expectations. So essentially, what we're saying is suspense in any form that's either building an emotion along with the player or holding the player's mentality in a certain spot. And so to explore this a little bit, we're going to be looking at a couple case studies from some narrative games that we really like. We'll be looking at Firewatch and Heartbeat Melodies, which essentially we're going to be exploring how different tempi can have different impacts.
Is it the plural of tempo?
If it's not, then it is now. Can affect, yeah. How the tempo can bring different emotions out. In Oxenfree, we're going to be looking at subverting expectations, both from what the player is going to anticipate from the story, as well as kind of your trust of what the story is telling you is happening. And then in What Remains of Edith Finch, we're going to be looking at playing against the picture and basically contrasting different artistic elements in the same moment to create interesting juxtapositions.
Also, very slight spoiler warnings. Maybe we're trying not to tell any important parts of the plot, but you might end up, seeing something that may or may not give any kind of spoiler. So just very small spoiler alert. So first we're going to start with Firewatch. So this is a small game by Campo Santo and composed by Chris Remo, and it's a very, very beautiful game. It's a mystery set in the Wyoming wilderness in the Grand Tetons area in 1989. So you're this man who is a fire watcher, so he's patrolling the area, keeping an eye out for forest fires or rambunctious teens, and you have one companion named Delilah who you communicate with over radio. And so there's something strange that happens in the game, and that's what really drives the plot forward. And we're going to look at how suspense is used in this kind of mystery aspect.
So we mentioned before that there's a difference for movies and games, which is we put out Discord, but Discord doesn't want to leave.
Apologies, you're going to hear pings.
So the big difference is the interaction element, which poses some interesting things in terms of the music and audio. So the big thing is that soundtracks are framed literally to the frame, not even to the second, not to the beat. They'll move things around so it hits exactly in the moment that an action hits, or to hit a swell. In games, the time is a little bit more fluid because, you're walking around. No, you don't know exactly how long a scene takes. I know for me, it always takes much longer than it needs to because I'm always afraid of missing something. And so getting around that question of the ambiguity of how long time will take, there's a lot of different approaches you can take. To name a few, which are not all used in Firewatch, but first off, you can just avoid having music in the first place.
Super interesting.
Focus on ambient sounds, focus on the dialogue, even in some cases just use effective silence, which can be very powerful in the right moment. You could also write long songs, which you hear a lot in overworld themes, so that way you have the repetition, but if you have a 5-6 minute song, it's not going to bother anyone, and it's going to be able to build a large variety of emotions and motifs. You can use some form of variations or generative music to have some randomness. That just, you might have a couple of notes that may or may not hit, which means even if there is repetition, the individual phrases aren't going to be on a direct loop. So that can keep things interesting. Or you can just not even try and look at repetition as a problem and fully embrace it, which is really the heart of what we're talking about in Firewatch. That was not a pun, I'm sorry.
What?
That was not a pun, I'm sorry.
Oh. No, it wasn't. All right, moving on. So on this point of repetition, so as Justin just said, Firewatch embraces a lot of repetitive motifs in its OST. But in many cases, not in Firewatch, they do it very well, but repetition is really tricky to handle correctly. Oh my God, why? Okay. If you're too simple with your repetition, you don't really like hit the desired emotion you're trying to achieve, and it can make the sound feel barren and empty and lacking. But if it's, on the other hand, if it's too complex, it can become distracting, makes it, you feel overwhelmed as a player, and it can sometimes be annoying and starts to take away from the story instead of adding to the story. So this is all just a big balancing act. How much is too much, how much is too little, and finding that balance is really the key to using repetition in suspense.
Yeah. So in terms of the simplicity, we mentioned, like, this part's going to be a lot about tempo. So we wanted to go into first a little biology tangent.
Gross.
And talk about what's the tempo of our heartbeats, as in, like, what is the most human tempo that we're used to. So the typical resting heartbeat is around 60 to 100.
Beats per minute.
Yeah, that's beats per minute. And as you get stressed, you get excited, or you're doing some kind of physical activity, your heartbeat goes up. So the tempo, the metronome of your life essentially increases. And then your maximum heart rate, which is just, you should never go above this or you will have issues, is about 220 minus your age. So if you're 20 years old, you're never really going to go above 200. And then if we think about that and look at it in the context of different musical tempos, to bring up some common ones that you'll see a lot in classical music, andante, which is like at a walking pace, nice and calm, is in that lower range of a resting heartbeat, about 56 to 88. These numbers might be subjective depending on your sources. Adagio, at ease, is similar, focused on a calm feeling, 66 to 76. Moderato is when things start having a little bit more motion, a little bit more energetic. That's right at 100. So that's right at that breaking point when stress starts to play a factor. Allegro is lively in your 120s. Prestissimo is just extremely fast. Presto is a little bit below that, but you get into that 160 to 200 range. And so you can see that when we talk about tempos in terms of like the calmness versus excitement, we have a very strong correlation of just what we intrinsically understand, which I would like to think is probably based off of actually our heart rates, because that's something we experience at every moment, I hope. And, you know, it's so ingrained in just our existence, you don't even think about it, but if you take a moment to listen, you can notice that. Yeah, so we're predisposed to kind of what these meanings are. When we hear things in a different tempo, calm is going to be around your resting heart rate, excited is going to be faster than that. And you can use the changes to exemplify, like if the tempo is speeding up, building excitement. And then the other thing is we just wanted to point out that when you get really fast, 90 BPM versus 180 BPM. 90 would be really calm, 180 would be really excited, really fast. And depending on a composition, it might be ambiguous which one of those tempos you're actually at, whether you're writing in, you know, cut time or 4/4. So it's just always good that when you're thinking about if you have a fast tempo, really looking at those strong beats to make sure that the understanding is where you want it to be at.
This is all you.
Okay.
Go for it.
Yeah, so we can use different BPMs as kind of a foundation to pose where our level of stress may be in a song. And it becomes so intrinsic to the mood that it is essentially like, you know, sometimes you use instruments, sometimes you use genres. And you can just use the rhythm as the focal point of a song, focus on the beats to get the mood across. So usually when you're doing this, you want to avoid syncopation, you want to avoid too much complexity. Yeah, really try to focus on the time. This also helps make it easily loopable and very flexible. So that way, if you want to add other sounds to build up in like a vertical orchestration, or you want to be able to cleanly transition into maybe a battle theme or some kind of stinger, it makes it very easy to do that. It's also a good way to kind of connect with the player, in that if you're walking around, we talked that empathy is an important bit of storytelling in video games, and if you can connect the tempo to something like a heartbeat, that there's going to be some kind of understanding that you have between the player and the real life person. And I guess the player and the character in the game. And then lastly, if you have a very simple tempo, you leave a lot of room for the ambient sounds, dialogues, and other elements to come into play, which means that it never gets too boring and it doesn't distract, because you have, anything can be considered music depending on who you ask, and it just creates some natural variation as you go through the piece.
All right, so let's do some examples now. We've been talking at you a lot. That was a lot of build up to explain this. I promise there won't be as much for the other two games. So we're just going to highlight a few of the different, heartbeat melodies that are in Firewatch, so you can see, how what's happening in the game corresponds to the tempo of the music and how you would be feeling in that situation. So what we have here is the intro of the game. Yeah, turn that up. Turn it up. Higher. Blast it!
Projector, so you gotta switch your device.
Oh, okay.
Go to your sound preferences.
Yeah. Output device?
Output should be
Accent. Oh, okay.
Watch the master feed.
Yeah, I brought it down.
Yeah. Bring it up.
We'll restart this in a second.
Is this the right?
I think I needed to raise volume. All right. Let's redo this.
That's not the right fader.
All right. Again, so this is an example of around 60 BPM. So this is very melancholy, calm. So these first few minutes are, it's learning about his relationship with his wife before they got married. It's kind of happy, contented, on repeat as you're choosing these dialogue options. And they get married, they'll get a dog. And then right here, this guitar picks up, and it takes on a more downcast tone as some depressing events are happening in their to get more serious, the guitar picks up and it drives this somber, serious melody and slowly removes that original contented, not so much happy, but not as sad melody from the beginning. So
yeah. So like in context of some of the other slides, like we start at 60, that's just an introduction to the game. That's kind of your basis for where we're going to go from there.
Yeah.
Where's that button?
All right. Oh, warning, there is a swear word or two in the clip, because they do swear in this game.
Is that coming from you?
No, that's not coming from me. That's coming from another room.
Okay. Let's go through this a little quicker though.
All right, so
we have to get into that site.
this is a tense situation. Someone is
What the fuck is going on? People are listening to us?
I don't know.
So
Our
here,
radios are tapped? Are you fucking
some of the things
serious?
I wanted to highlight.
Our radios are definitely tapped. That's why I left you the one you just got.
How is this even possible?
This is during
I don't know, Henry.
when a lot of excitement.
What do you
is coming
know?
up. The
I
tempo
know that I'm scared.
actually accelerates throughout this sequence.
Are there any other
Around
lookouts this is
100,
happening to?
100.
Someone else
It goes
in
up
on this?
to-
Anyone?
yeah.
Throughout
This is
that,
just happening to us.
building
Everyone else is
excitement as a
fine.
way to exemplify the stress a little more.
Yeah. So it puts you more actively into the scene to really make you start feeling this panic that these characters are feeling.
I don't know if we need the last example.
Okay. Yeah,
Let's skip through.
this is a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I like Firewatch a lot. I like these examples. So this is, we'll skip through some of it, but this is
It's all right. I'm just
really
gonna
intense. You can
hike
hear
back.
that.
We have the
fast
wave
stuff
receiver, and tomorrow we can figure out what to do.
That's just kind of driving you forward as you're learning about all of these secrets. It's very ominous.
No, they're doing
A
something
good
with the soil
example
out
of
here
why
too.
we
It's
were
all
saying
gridded
that
off.
Sometimes you need to be very.
Hey, maybe you were
particular
right about the
how you play
lichens.
Music, whether it's going to be 180 or 90, you can feel this is heavy. Just keep
And then you have this guitar melody continuing on, really moving you forward as you're trying to struggle to feel like you're in some kind of horror game. But this isn't a horror game. You're just walking through the woods. You really don't feel like someone like has to be wrong. So it's really building up and using our knowledge of horror being against us to achieve this kind of emotion in a game where this emotion is not really applicable. All right. So moving on. Next game. This one is a little bit of a horror game-ish. So Oxenfree is by Night School Studio, and Scientific is the composer. So this is a kind of a supernatural thriller about these friends that are on this island, and they unwillingly open this rift into like this ghostly dimension. So the most important thing about this is that a lot of there are several different endings that you can choose based on your dialogue options. So all of this dialogue is timed and self-determined. So it does put a lot of pressure on you as the player to make the right choice, and it really drops you into this game.
Cool.
Yeah.
And we're going to be focusing on some other ways that the dialogue subverts not the dialogue, that the audio and the music subvert expectations to create some contrast between what you're anticipating versus what actually happens.
Yeah, this is just a summary slide that I said already.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, so it's essentially half a team drama, half a horror game, which are very different things. Most of the tone is pretty melancholic and calm, and then the horror moments are very gritty and very kind of like, I think a lot of the inspirations were from 80s horrors, like some of the older.
They use a lot of the tropey static and warping of audio and stuff, but it's a very cool effect in this game.
Yeah. And so in terms of subverting expectations, to first have an expectation, you need some kind of trust, which we wanted to talk about in the context of storytelling. So every story has an element of trust, which can mean a couple of different things. But in general, as a world is kind of built out and you start to understand the characters, you start to understand the politics, the economies, whatever, you have some understanding of who people are, how they would react, and what is a realistic reaction. So that's basically, how do you trust the world? How do you trust the writing and the author? And then, in addition to that, you learn to trust yourself of this understanding, because in order to see something's realistic, you need to be able to anticipate actions of the entities firsthand in the first place. So trust goes both ways, both with the story and with your own personal instincts. And once you have this trust built up, anytime you break it, it's very significant and will pull you out of the moment in a story to probably look at something with a slightly different perspective.
Yeah. So Oxenfree, what this game does particularly well is, it takes all of these, preconceived expectations about what you are expecting to come next, and they just crash right through it. So they break this trust over and over again. So you start to distrust everything about this game. Walking down a street, you don't trust it. You don't trust anything, which, highlights a lot of specific moments they want and adds a lot of suspense. Yeah. So, put more up. I want to see. So short term, you have this initial, breaking of trust, and it creates stark contrast between what you're expecting and the story. But long term, you grow to distrust the storytelling and your own instincts. So you're just never able to rest. You're always in a state of unease.
Yeah, so like an obvious example is if you're playing a horror game, you might have your first jump scare that comes out. And that's going to be a one moment where you're like, okay, I see what I'm getting into. And that's going to be a really, really strong emotion. And from then on, in a game like that, anytime you go by a door, you're going to be questioning whether it's there. And a lot of times they will wait just until you stop anticipating that you're going to get that jump scare to make an even more effective one come out.
Yeah. So some stories, build suspense with what is there in the game. Oxenfree does a really good job of building suspense with what they withhold from you. All right.
So the first example we have, which we're not showing the whole thing because this is essentially like right before the credits. Towards the end of the game, there's a big dramatic ending, and then you have a calm kind of retrospective. It's about 5 minutes long.
What happened on the island used to pop into my head every single day, and then every other day. And then a week went by, and I realized I hadn't thought about it at all. I guess that's... I don't know. It's good, I think. But anyways, well, if it matters, I decided to stay in town and go to college here. It's practically up the road, and I just wanted something familiar, I guess.
Yeah.
But anyways, what time is it?
So kind of like what we wanted to show there is like the music gets you in a calm state of mind, and that credit sequence is so long that all of a sudden you really think it is the end, and to the point where whenever I finish a game, I always like look up on Reddit to like see what other people think. A lot of people just thought it was the credits and ended, which is kind of crazy that people didn't stay. And you get a little bit of like the screens, the angle shifts up a little bit, which is unnatural. And you start to kind of question a little bit, and then you get that shift, which is really jarring against the calm, amelodic music. And from that point on, you don't really know what the ending is, what's real, what's not real. And yeah, without spoiling anything else, it just ends, it leaves it on a very ambiguous note.
Yep. You just, after you turn off the TV and the game is done, you just don't feel okay. It's not satisfying.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Oxenfree, that's like one example of all of those wacky effects. Here is another one. Since we are running a little behind, we
could probably skip
this. They did a lot of the pitch shifting, a lot of the static. There's these things called loops in the game where, you repeat a scene over and over again, and some stuff changes every iteration. And this is a great way of building suspense. So you should look this up because we are running out of time. But we have one more example for Oxenfree that we will show. This one I like.
Yeah.
But here is a prime example of Oxenfree building suspense with what there isn't. This is an example of them taking away music and effects and leaving you with silence, which is sometimes more unsettling than creepy songs.
I just can't really get this to change, or... Mom, can you... Mom? Whoa,
Jonas, wait! Jonas,
And then there's
I
silence.
need you. Come back. Come.
So you have, you just lost a companion, they vanished, who knows where they went, and then you're left with just silence and dark. There's no background music, and it leaves you more unsettled because there's nothing to ground yourself with. They don't give you anything to hold on to. So it tips your perception onto its side right before you go into, the next part, which will be your, a bigger boss battle or something.
Okay. And the last game we're going to talk a little about is What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a very unique game. To describe the plot, it sounds like the most depressing experience you'll ever have. You are the last surviving family member of a cursed family. You're going through their old, creepy, bizarre house, and you learn how all of the family members died. And that is the game. And so it sounds really depressing, but really the mood is not super defeatist and nihilistic. It's a little bit more melancholic. And what it does is it uses the contrast of this really dark story with brighter visuals to make the stories of everyone's death a little bit more digestible, so that way you can really focus on kind of the emotions and mindset that the character would be going through, rather than the experience of those deaths at the time, in the moment of the death, which would be a lot darker. Yeah. And then for the audio aspect, we're looking at playing against the picture, which we mentioned, contrasting different artistic forms, which in this case is going to be some music, some visuals, and some of the writing, all kind of playing against each other, telling their own stories at the same time. Usually when you have this kind of contrast, this is in the next slide, right?
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. When you have this kind of contrast,
Just say it.
I'm just skipping through. So prior to this, we were talking about kind of creating empathy with heartbeat techniques. We talked about breaking expectations of different moments in time with subverting expectations. Here we're kind of focusing on contrasting elements in the same period of time, which is what this slide is saying, which in this case we're mostly looking at the picture, audio, and writing. Whenever you play against the picture and you have multiple moods in the different art forms, usually you're kind of signifying that something is off, while in Oxenfree, when you're subverting expectations, you're kind of distrusting the author, while here the author is straight up telling you, this is not what it's expecting. There isn't, still maintains an element of trust. It often represents something with kind of a broken state of mind, which a good example is Sandy Cohen from BioShock, who is this artistic entertainment genius who snapped, and when you fight him, it's playing Waltz of the Flowers, which is much lighter than the rest of that game. BioShock is super dark, but also one of my favorite narrative games. Well, if you consider it narrative. It can bring levity to a darker situation, which is more of what this game is doing, and making it digestible, making it possible to go through about a dozen of these deaths without just, fully feeling defeated by the end. Or it can imply that something is coming or that something can't be trusted, which, a lot of times, if there's some kind of jump scare, you might have music start to cut out, or the music start to change to a different tone, or just have super empty whole tones that leave the room for anything to come up. And looking at some of the examples.
Another swear word warning, I think. There is one swear word in this clip. So this is basically learning about how their child drowns in a bathtub. Yikes. So This is from the kid's point of view. He's maybe one.
Hold on, I don't want Gregory to hear this.
And the parents are having an argument on the side of why this happened.
I wish he could have told us about the world he saw. There's so much I don't understand about Gregory, about everything. But I know what happened wasn't your fault. I'm sure he's happy. And he'd want you to be happy too.
They couldn't cope with the death of their child. And so you just have a big mishmash of a lot of things. And if you just read the story up front, which you can do after the fact, it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard to read.
Yeah.
And that's just, again, one of the many stories.
Yeah. So the artistic choice here, it draws you in a way that you're not too attached to what's actually happening to, these people. You're playing, it's like fun to kind of play as, you're like, doing little puzzles and stuff. So you're constantly held in this middle ground where you know that, what is actually happening, but you're not feeling like you're playing what is actually happening. So it accentuates the aspects of the story that need to be told in a way that you could handle. You're doing this one.
Okay.
His mind began to wander. I asked him to describe
Lewis
it.
was dead. I believe the main character's older
brother.
This is another really interesting one. It's kind of long, so we're just
we're
going to
gonna-
skip through some moments.
We're gonna break down a few aspects of this scene
Yeah.
because it really pulls a lot of things together that we've been talking about.
Yeah, so you can kind of skip through while I talk about it. And what we want to talk about here is kind of like parallel storytelling. So because you have different emotions in the
He said he started small,
absolutely tell
imagining a labyrinth. He'd feel his way about. Then something moved. Bats
the really interesting thing here is that
and toads and things that have not names.
the dialogue,
He knew it was all in his head. But he took it very seriously. I had hoped he'd find himself. But he found something more. I worried about him then. I even encouraged him. It seemed very promising at first. He told me he'd made a new friend.
focus of which story is
Minneapolis. Until one day he forgot to go home from the cannery.
basically not even
Even as his mother pleaded with him, part of Lewis kept sailing on. Even then, his logic remained sound. He knew the world was all in his imagination. But he was so proud of having created it. In his own eyes, he'd become something greater than a king. He began to despise the man with a royal...
Oh,
world we know.
Yeah, no, I can't see the video on my...
pained him to remember Lewis, the cannery worker. He began to despise the man with a royal contempt.
That is you.
I still thought I could save him. Even after he said he was being crowned king over all the lands of wonder. The palace would be packed with his companions. Including the wise Calico who'd insisted on inviting him. His queen waited, holding his crown. There was only one thing left to do. Bend down his head. And the rest I think you know. Mrs. Finch, your son was a kind man.
Foreshadowing that right from the beginning.
Yeah. So they come full circle with that sound that you started with ending.
Yeah. So there you have a lot of different stories, and it's interesting the way they shift the prominence, and you get a little weird taste of everyone's perspective.
Yeah. It's very dark, but it is very interesting. All of these games that we've talked about now are no more than 4 hours in length. So if you really wanted to, you could just go back and play these games like right now on Steam. They're very manageable, they're very quick and easy, and we highly recommend you should experience them for yourself because they're very, very, very good games.
Oxenfree, I think, is a little longer, but there is a sequel coming out. They were acquired by Netflix, so I'm excited for that.
Netflix does games now. All right. So this brings us to the end, just right on time. So a little bit of like summary conclusions. Narrative games really do provide a unique storytelling medium in a way that, you know, books and movies and TV shows do not because of this interaction aspect. It builds all this empathy and it really immerses you in the world because you need to make choices as the character.
Yeah.
So suspense is a very useful technique for these narrative games to help engage this player and enhance, you know, specific beats of the story and elements to really, you know, bring it to life.
Yeah, really the power of the story comes from being able to control the experiencer's emotions and have them connect to the elements that you want them to connect to.
Sorry. Discord is closed, I promise. My computer just doesn't seem to realize that.
Okay, we can continue. Yeah, so we looked at some examples of Firewatch of kind of like short-term using the heartbeat melodies to set a level of calmness and anxiety. We looked at Oxenfree, ways that we can contrast expectations with what actually happens. And in What Remains of Edith Finch, contrasting multiple artistic elements in the same moment to tell multiple stories at the same time. Yeah, and all of these are, you know, focusing on emotions, focusing on
Suspense, storytelling, all of the above. Yeah,
all the buzzwords.
All of those buzzwords we've been using. Yeah. All right. Snake warning on the next slide for anyone who's terrified of snakes. But thank you. Any questions? Here, if you want to contact us, our emails are here. And then here are my two lovely babies, Rigatoni and Ziti. They had to be on the slide because they couldn't be here today. Yeah. And any questions? Hit us up.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry if you said this and I just didn't quite hear it, but with Edith Finch, I think the two examples you gave were really interesting of that juxtaposition of the upbeat music with the really serious things happening. And with the first one, when you were talking about Edith Finch, I felt like you were giving multiple possible interpretations of that juxtaposition. I guess I'm curious if you have kind of a theory of what you think the game is really trying to do with having, like, how are we supposed to interpret what you've been saying about death based on, like, how you think sound and music?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question in terms of, I think a lot of what it is that, you know, with anyone's death, there's different ways that you can remember them. You can purely remember the sadness. You can remember the unique personalities. You can remember the legacy they left behind, and all of those are valid, and depending on your connection with them, they're going to be very different. And to the main character, like, that's their family. To us, we don't even know the main character. So I think it's just a way to make you kind of like empathize and feel some of the emotions she's feeling. And even if it's not for the same reason, you can kind of like, I don't know, like correlate I'm trying to think. I guess, yeah, like correlate those same emotions, but for a different reason while still being told the original story of their death. I don't know. I think that would probably be my interpretation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think I like your answer. You have a good answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Did you have any specific thoughts on that?
It's just something that I originally wrote something on, like, I don't know, like, viewing it again and looking at how the main Evie kind of is dealing with death. I guess I had a similar interpretation of, like, we all have different ways we can cope with death.
Yeah.
The old woman Evie has, like, a certain way that she deals with death.
Oh, the grandmother, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, she,
And so, I guess, I like the ambiguity because then, as a player, I'm thinking, is that a healthy way to deal with death? Is that reaction? Like, but that there are these things, the joy of the life of
Yeah, so for the rest of the audience, the grandmother of the main character, she preserved all of her children and relatives' like bedrooms in like pristine condition, and then like padlocked the doors. So you need to like crawl around, cut hidey holes in the house to find them, and then you can like learn about their lives through how they lived in their bedroom, effectively, and what you can find there. So I don't know if that's healthy or not, but.
And then you also have the
That's what they
opposite, which is the mother who doesn't want any of the grandmother's stories to be heard, and she's just fully focused on the sadness, and that's it, and trying to leave and run away. But does anyone else have any questions? Yeah.
So suspense can be paralyzing for some players, and that's not always a bad thing for a lot of players. If they try a game and they're like, oh, this isn't for me too much, then they can back out. I'm wondering about the players that are more on the fence. Maybe they want something that's a little more suspenseful, but then they try it and they're like, oh, this is a lot, I can't keep going. The problem with games is that it's like, with movies, they just keep playing whether you want them or not. But with games, if you don't want to engage, you can just stop, or you can alter or leave the game. So my question is, for a player that's on the fence and you're trying to build a suspenseful moment, how do you give them a little nudge that isn't too much for them, that isn't just going to be full stop?
Yeah.
I think Firewatch would be a really great example of it.
I was going to say the same.
Because, I mean, it's not like, it's not really a horror. It's more of a light mystery. And a lot of it is exploring the wilderness. You have, after something happens, you have, a calm moment. You go back to your tower, recoup. You also have Delilah on the radio as your lifeline. You can have conversations with her the entire time. And just in terms of the techniques used, the scenes that we showed very briefly were really some of the only super suspenseful scenes. So a lot of it is very subtle, not very in your face. And they give you a lot of beautiful imagery to surround yourself with that I think helps take the edge off of it. Because it's hard to feel too scared if you're looking at beautiful mountains at the sunset or something like this, So they do a really good job easing you into something like that. Whereas Oxenfree, you don't get a choice.
Yeah. Well, but in terms of nudging players who are on the fence forward, so some of the things that Firewatch does that's interesting is one, you're on the walkie-talkie for pretty much the entire time. And so the dialogue often will push you forward if you're being really slow. And there's so much dialogue that if you are taking your time, it's still going to keep going and it's still interesting. They don't repeat lines or anything like that. But it's kind of like you have someone else there holding your hand the entire time. And you can also not respond if you want to be purely isolated and say I don't want to talk right now. So there's ways to use foley and sound effects to push you forward. Sometimes, another thing Firewatch does is when there's key story moments, it starts to get rid of some of your choice and put you in a little bit more of a linear place to walk, while still making it feel natural like you're in the woods. But this just leaves you with less choice and a better way to focus on what's there. The main choice that you do have, though, is always exploring the environment. You can read clipboards, you can leave notes, you can look at pictures, and there's a lot of environmental storytelling that you can kind of figure out a lot of what has happened. But if you don't want to deal with that stress and really understand it, you can just rush through and just get the main bits. So there's an element of choice of whether you actually need to engage with anything in a game or not. And I also think that foley and little voice cues are other ways to push you forward.
So what I'm hearing is having some kind of emotional lifeline that is constant. In the case of Firewatch, you're saying you have somebody on the walkie-talkie, you have the environment that's around you, and that's just would that be all the specific points that you're saying are really good, but as far as generalizing that to other things, when you say having that emotional lifeline is your stability, and that's something that players have?
I mean, me personally, even in real life, having someone just to text if I'm feeling freaked out is a lifesaver. It really can help calm me down. So I think humans, a lot of humans look for that emotional connection and that other person there just to make you feel less alone and less isolated. So having that kind of emotional connection to something more steady is a way to really just kind of ground you. And
I think one other thing is that there are a lot of different types of games, and I think it's really hard to make a game that's really going to cater to everyone. A lot of times if you give too many tools to push someone forward, if someone wants a really scary horror game, that might make it not as scary. So knowing your target audience is definitely part of this. A game, the games that we're talking about here, a lot of people would kind of call them walking simulators, which is not something that I would recommend to everybody. So, yeah, I don't know if that's really a good answer or not, but I think it really depends on, how intense of a mood you really want to hit. But I do think that being aware that you can put those things into place is important, and being intentional whether you do or don't have them. And I know what a lot of games will do is that they'll have things to push you forward, and then if you don't do anything for 5 or 10 minutes, they'll have something stronger that will force you out, that will like an Oxenfree, for example, there are dialogue choices, and if you don't answer within I swear, sometimes it's like a second and a half to read the 4 dialogue choices and pick one. No option is an option, which can make story impacts, which adds a lot of stress.
Yeah.
And it's one thing that I really hate about that game, but I don't hate it because it's bad. I'm slow.
All right. Do we have is there a panel after us?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay. Oh, we have 30 minutes?
Oh, okay. Oh.
Wait, what? Okay.
Okay.
Oh, my. Why did you do that? Sorry, someone in the audience just Discord messaged me, so I got a ping on my laptop. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
So it is 11 o'clock, so that means there's probably other panels elsewhere that everyone wants to go to. But if you have any questions, still, we'll hang around. And yeah, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all for
I
coming.
hope you learned something. I hope.